Hi everyone, welcome to our module on sociology of culture, or in other words, cultural studies. As we get into this content, it's important that we're all on the same page about what culture means, as this is a word that we all use and see and hear all the time, but per the sociological definition of this term, culture is, in short, the way of life for a society. That means all of the different things that make up day-to-day life, the things we call social facts, the beliefs, values, practices, the norms of a particular group of people. And the interesting thing about culture is there's, of course, a lot of diversity. Every single person is a part of at least one, but often more than one culture. And for a little bit of a refresher, when we're talking about culture being the way of life for a society, society is, again, people who live in a definable community and who share a culture. You can move from one society to another, of course, and you might experience what we call culture shock in that experience of moving from culture to culture, society to society. So why the heck do we study culture as sociologists? Sometimes this seems like it's more in the purview of anthropologists, perhaps, or maybe other kinds of humanities or social sciences areas. But culture is really influential to every aspect of social life and our own individual experiences and actions and behaviors. So the way that we live our lives, our own personal individual ways of life, these are going to be very much impacted by the culture that we are a part of. And our culture shapes how our society functions and vice versa. Society and the people who make up that society influence what that culture might look like. And there is a lot of diversity in cultures around the world, and so when we study culture, we can see and appreciate and respect and understand all of that diversity across the human race. And finally, we can understand ourselves and others a little bit better as we learn more about our culture, other cultures, and we see kind of just really what's out there in the world. The more we know about other people's experiences and ways of life, the more open-minded we may become, and the more realistic our picture of the world as a whole might be. There are some things that are common to all cultures, regardless of the time period, regardless of the location or the society in question. There are some unique traits that every culture will share. These will vary from culture to culture and what they look like, but first, every single culture has aspects of what we call material culture. And these are exactly what they sound like: material, tangible things, objects, typical day-to-day life kinds of possessions that people in that society might use. So some examples could be things like food, eating utensils, other kinds of tools, clothing, religious figurines, any other kinds of items people interact with regularly in that culture or that society. This also, of course, includes a lot of media as well, be that print media or other types like maybe movies, TV shows, podcasts, and so on. On the contrary, non-material culture, this is going to be the stuff you can't pick up and hold, not material. These are going to be, social facts, ideas, attitudes, beliefs, things that are more so thoughts within the brains of the people in that society or culture. So we might have the belief that you should shake hands while meeting someone, in contrary to the belief that you should bow when meeting someone, different kinds of cultural practices. Maybe the belief that discussing birthdays early is bad luck. That's something that we see in German culture. And so these are things that people will know and ideas that they'll share, but you can't physically pick up or interact with non-material culture. We do also have some other kinds of cultural universals, and these are going to be patterns or traits that are common to every single kind of society around the globe, also back in time as well throughout human history. Some things like humor. It might look different from place to place, but that's a characteristic we see in every single culture. People also, of course, love to bond over food for holidays or other kinds of get-togethers. Humans across the board care for other humans in a variety of different ways. That's something that we need to survive, quite literally, as a social species. And the arts and tool usage, these are also things that have been around for a very, very long time across human history, across all kinds of different cultures. A few other important key concepts for us to learn as we get into our discussion of cultural studies. First, we have the idea of ethnocentrism, or the lens or practice of ethnocentrism. This is where a person, or maybe a researcher or a group, evaluates or critiques another culture, a different culture that they are not part of, according to the standards of their own culture. And this, of course, can be a judgmental stance in certain contexts. It's definitely beneficial for us to understand other cultures in terms of their own standards and practices, and not immediately jump to conclusions about different kinds of valuation as far as, my culture is better than yours, or you're doing things wrong, or this culture is backwards, or those kinds of statements or beliefs. All of those would fall under this kind of category of ethnocentrism, or thinking in an ethnocentrist way. This can, of course, inform the practice of cultural imperialism. This is kind of what imperialism in general might include: conquest, colonization, colonialism, all of these different kinds of practices. This involves the deliberate and often forceful imposition of one's own cultural values onto another culture, often with the goal of erasing or replacing that other culture, usually with the foundation of believing that your own culture is better than the other culture that you are imposing your values upon. Cultural relativism is a little bit more of a realistic picture of, or that we can use to assess other kinds of cultures. This is where we look at that culture and we assess or evaluate it based on its own standards. We have to, of course, know that culture's standards and practices and sort of what that way of life looks like for people in that culture. But this is going to be a little bit more realistic, a little bit more fair, perhaps, of an evaluation stance, because this is going to be us looking at that culture and practices and maybe issues that are occurring within that cultural context with the perspective of the people who are included in that context, or who participate in it and who understand it a little bit more deeply than somebody who is not a part of that culture. Xenocentrism is kind of the opposite of ethnocentrism. Xeno, as a Latin prefix, means kind of like outside of, or sometimes alien, perhaps. You think of like xenomorphs from the Alien movies. So xenocentrism is the belief that another culture is superior to one's own culture. So, for example, if I believe that, insert culture, the culture of a certain place that I'm not a part of, I don't live there, I'm not part of that society, if I believe that that culture is superior to my own culture, that is a xenocentrist attitude. And then culture shock, of course. This is something I think we are very familiar with, at least in our American cultural lexicon. This is where you experience personal disorientation when you are confronted with an unfamiliar way of life, or in other words, you go to another culture, a society that you're not part of, and you're going to see and experience a lot of different things that might not be very familiar, and we tend to kind of take our own culture for granted a little bit. We get very used to the way that things work and the way people interact, and so when things are different in another place, it can kind of take a lot of brain power and emotional regulation, perhaps, to get through the day-to-day as you're learning so many new things so quickly and you're having so many new kinds of experiences. And this can be, of course, again, a disorienting kind of experience, but it's not necessarily a negative experience. Culture shock can be kind of a fun part of traveling and, learning more about the diversity of other places around the world. When we're thinking about the way of life of a society, it's important that we investigate the social facts of that society or the cultures that are present there. Values and beliefs, of course, are a couple different kinds of social facts. Values are a culture's standard for discerning what is good and just. Maybe we're kind of looking at morality here, things that we believe to be good or bad. These tend to be kind of big picture, conceptual, ideological kinds of ideas. The values that you hold tend to be a little bit broad, a little bit complex, not super concrete, tiny, specific details. They're going to be a little bit broader, a little bit more encompassing. Beliefs, on the other hand, these are ideas that people hold to be true. things that you believe, which these can usually be shared through statements or sentences. They may be a little bit more specific, a little bit more narrow, less big picture, conceptual, ideological kinds of stuff, but there is, of course, overlap between these two different types of social facts. A few common values in the United States that you may be familiar with: individualism, informality, assertiveness, punctuality, efficiency, personal achievement. These tend to be things that a lot of Americans value. Not every single person, of course, but we have some overarching trends across the culture. And what we're seeing here is kind of these bigger picture ways of life or lenses or perspectives or the valuation of certain types of patterns of behavior or dispositions or demeanors. This is going to be, again, kind of a broader type of idea, while beliefs, on the other hand, typically we might be able to describe these through statements or sentences. Maybe we would say, if we hold a lot of these American values, that individuals should be self-sufficient, or meritocracy is ideal, hard work leads to success, the American dream is possible, good things happen to good people. All of these might be beliefs that a person could hold to be true, ideas that they have that they're like, that is definitely how things are, that's the way the world works, that's what I think is reality. And these might be based on a person's values, but you can also, of course, have beliefs that are not really relevant to values at all. Maybe if you believe that blue is the prettiest color, that would be, of course, a belief as well, but probably not something that's quite related to one's values or kind of those foundational morality kinds of things that make up their perspectives. We also have the concepts of ideal and real culture. When we're looking at ideal culture, we can think of this as kind of a little bit sci-fi, a little bit utopia. This is the standards a society would like to embrace and live up to, kind of in a perfect world. But if we want to be a little bit less sci-fi here, we can think of this as like an achievable utopia, something that's not completely just wild and really out there, but the standards that are actually possible to meet. But this would be a combination of a lot of ideals that are just, not quite in alignment with what we see in reality. Because of course it is difficult to get to that near utopia type of culture or society. But that's why real culture is what we tend to actually study as sociologists. We do also look into what people would think ideal culture could be, different issues that are going on in our reality that maybe if we were to remove or solve those issues, we could get closer to our ideal culture. But our real culture, that's reality, the way society really is, based on what actually occurs and exists, things that we can measure and track and research and describe as sociologists or as scientists of whatever variety. So when we think about ideal and real culture, I think it's important to reflect on what our ideal culture would be like if we had all of the things that we would love to have, the most perfect society in the United States. What would that really look like? And it's also important, of course, to reflect on how our reality is different than that ideal, and also why it is that way. We'll continue throughout our discussion of different sociological concepts. Through the course, we'll learn more about why our reality is not so much a utopia, but just reflect a little bit on these ideas, and we'll keep expanding on them as we go. Norms are another type of social fact, like values and beliefs. These are kind of the rules of conduct for day-to-day life that a society or a culture is kind of based upon. And they can be more or less strict, more or less visible, or important. There's kind of a variation between the severity of consequences as far as what happens when norms are violated. But in general, we kind of expect that people in the community, in our culture, will follow norms. If you are following norms, you're kind of following the rules. You're sort of staying in line. aligning your behavior with the status quo. You're probably not really making waves or disrupting anything in any way, meeting expectations essentially. And of course, we'll talk about deviance in a lot more detail later on, but deviance in one definition could be the violation of social norms. It's a little more complex than that, but we'll start there. Norms can be, of course, informal and formal. Informal ones being more of those day-to-day life kinds of behaviors or expectations. Usually informal norms are going to be things like maybe you cover your sneeze when you sneeze, cover your cough when you cough. You don't talk with food in your mouth. You shake hands when you meet someone. Things that are generally just typical cultural etiquette behaviors that are seen as polite, or maybe avoiding behaviors that are seen as rude. All of that kind of falls into the informal norms sort of category, while formal norms are going to be more set in stone, ink on paper kinds of rules, very established written rules. Probably people came together and decided on these rules, maybe as a group. Things like laws, speed limits, age limits for buying alcohol, maybe your employee handbook, student code of conduct, all of these kinds of more official rules. We don't tend to have official ink on paper rules as far as, don't talk with food in your mouth, but you might, depending on your home and your personal situation. But generally, we'll see kind of a distinction between informal and formal norms in that sense, and also in terms of what punishments might look like for if you violate these norms. To get a little bit deeper into the discussion of norms as well, we have to talk about mores and folkways. I have a picture of a moray eel here, if that helps, because I know this word looks like it should be pronounced as mores, possibly, but mores and folkways. Mores being norms that embody the moral views or principles of a group or a culture. Moral, more, the words sound kind of similar. These often have a religious foundation, but not always. They are generally those ideas about what is right or wrong, just or unjust, these big picture valuation kinds of beliefs. And of course, violating mores can be very, very serious. The consequences might be pretty serious. Things like believing that homicide or plagiarism are wrong. The expectation that you will not do those things falls in line with the mores of a culture, or those moral types of norms. Folkways are kind of like the ways of the folks. These are going to be norms in a culture that don't have those moral underpinnings. That's not really their foundation. And they tend to be, again, kind of those day-to-day life kinds of experiences. These might be a little bit more formal, informal. Things like, the way that you express yourself and interact with people on a regular basis. Greetings like shaking hands or kissing on the cheek. Different kinds of greetings across different cultures. Maybe the expectations of what you should wear in different contexts. What kinds of gifts you give on birthdays or for holidays, or when you give them, and kind of what that whole tradition or celebration might look like. All of these different kinds of things are the expectations of cultural life, but there's not a lot of morality attached to them. If you wear something that's seen as, maybe not quite appropriate for a particular context, like if you show up to a funeral in a tuxedo covered in sequins, that might not always be the most appropriate, depending on the situation. So that could be a violation of folkway kinds of norms, but that's not necessarily seen as an immoral or, massive offense in terms of morality, such as if you were to violate a more. So when violations of norms happen, we can call this deviance, or going against the grain, breaking the status quo. There's a lot of different labels for what that could be in terms of what breaking a norm might encompass. But generally within society or within cultures, we practice social control, and this is the regulation and enforcement of norms. This happens in a variety of different ways, but the goal here is to kind of maintain social order, keep things kind of functional, cohesive, balanced, however we'd like to describe that. Kind of keeping the status quo in place, keeping those rules and expectations in place, and ideally having people follow them for the sake of the culture or the society. Sanctions are the ways that we show approval or disapproval of behaviors. If somebody does something that goes against or follows a norm, we might see sanctions as the result. We can kind of use the word consequences as sort of a synonym for sanctions in a way. They can be positive or negative. So let's say a positive sanction, that's going to be a reward that is given for conforming to norms. So you met the expectations, you followed the rules, you might get positive sanctions as a result. So maybe you get a promotion at your job. Negative sanctions are going to be punishments for violating norms or engaging in deviance, perhaps. So you do something that is, going against a norm. It's maybe breaking a formal norm, breaking a law. You might face the negative sanction of being arrested as a consequence. Sanctions can also be formal or informal. Informal sanctions are a little bit more casual, day-to-day life kinds of stuff, face-to-face kinds of interactions. Maybe somebody gives you like a disapproving look or a verbal reprimand. Maybe they smile at you, maybe they pat you on the back. They do some kind of behavior that is pretty informal to recognize that you either went against or went along with a norm or expectation. Formal sanctions, these are going to be a lot more official, usually kind of more serious types of consequences or more meaningful kinds of rewards. So they're officially recognizing that a norm was violated or followed. If you are expelled for cheating, perhaps, or fired from your job, arrested or imprisoned, those would be, of course, some negative sanctions that are also formal sanctions as the result of violating a norm. But maybe you do something that's seen very positively. Maybe you face some positive sanctions or rewards that are also formal sanctions, like you get official military commendation, you get like a Purple Heart medal, or different kinds of promotions perhaps within a job context. These could be more on that formal side. A little bit less casual stuff that's going to probably have some ink on paper kinds of rules or standards to back it up. Every culture also, of course, uses symbols, uses language, means of communication in their day-to-day lives. Symbols being gestures or objects that have meaning that we, of course, have socially constructed as a culture. And we've constructed them in a way that we understand them together collectively. So things like maybe gestures like a thumbs up or the middle finger, the meaning that those gestures or those hand shapes have is different from place to place, and we have, as U.S. culture, agreed at some point, or kind of come to a consensus over time, that those gestures have meanings attached to them. Emojis as well, or different kinds of symbols or words. We can use all kinds of different objects as ways to communicate, and not necessarily objects as far as like an apple or a physical object you can hold, but like the pointer finger and middle finger up, that might be a peace sign, or you could draw the peace symbol with the circle with the little lines inside of it. You could write the word peace. All of these different things are ways or symbols to represent the same idea of peace. Language is a symbolic system of communication, so we're just putting together a whole bunch of different symbols with different meanings, making it into a cohesive type of structure, or giving it structure that we can use these different kinds of symbols to communicate with one another. Symbols could include things like letters or sounds that you can make vocally or with your voice. And when we combine those things and we give words meaning instead of just thinking of them as a whole bunch of different, funky sounds that are coming from somebody's voice box, as we add meaning to these things and we create this structure for them, this system, that is kind of what turns those symbols into what we consider a language. And we have this interesting idea, the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, that the way that we understand the world, the way that we think quite literally, is based on the language that we are familiar with. Often our mother tongue or your native language, the language that you grow up speaking or learning, or maybe multiple in some cases. But generally, the way that we think is constrained by language because we don't always have a word in every language to describe every kind of thing, every kind of object, every kind of experience, every sort of emotion. There's a lot of different stuff that we would like to describe in language, and sometimes we just don't really have the word for something. So we might come up with a new word. We might create things with new meaning, new symbols perhaps, for our language. Like let's say if we're talking about nieces and nephews and aunts and uncles, we don't really have a word to describe those as like a combined concept, right? It's a lot of work, I guess, to say, my niece and nephew and aunt and uncle, and so we have created the words nibblings and pibblings to describe those different family relationships. So nibblings being your nieces or nephews or the children of your siblings, regardless of gender, and then aunts and uncles being pibblings, the siblings of your parents. We could talk about whether we like those words themselves, but the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis would tell us that the way that we understand the world and we communicate is very much based on the language and the words and symbols that we have at our disposal. And so sometimes we have to expand that a little bit to fully encompass everything in the social world that we would like to discuss. And sometimes we just still are not completely there. There's a lot of words in other languages that we just don't really have a great translation for in English. Especially in German, there are a lot of really complex words that might describe entire experiences or feelings that we just need a whole lot more language to get at that idea in English, which shapes the way that we might think about things or the way that we might communicate. We also, of course, see a lot of use of symbols and a lot of messaging and meaning included within our media and other different kinds of things we might interact with in terms of our interests and our hobbies and the things that we consume in our culture or society. And we have this concept of high culture and pop culture. High culture being what we would see happening with wealthy citizens within the culture or society, interests or activities that tend to be pretty expensive, things like going to the opera or the ballet, eating lobster or caviar, not the most accessible kinds of activities or cultural practices. And because of this, because we have this kind of distinction or this label of high culture, kind of implying that there might be an opposite low culture, this has been criticized as classist, this idea of high culture, or at least labeling it as such, because more accessible cultural patterns or practices are not lesser necessarily. They're not low in comparison to the practices of the wealthy or the elite. They are just different, perhaps, and of course more widespread. They're a little bit less exclusive, perhaps, for more people to be able to access them. And so that's what pop culture, or the term popular culture, describes, is these more mainstream, more widespread patterns across the culture in terms of the interests and hobbies and activities and media that people are consuming. This might be things like watching Marvel movies, listening to pop music, things that are typical of a lot of people across society, and there's not a lot of cost barrier to accessing many of these kinds of things, as opposed to what we might see in high culture. But again, there is that criticism of the label of high culture and pop culture, or this kind of division between them. And so I urge you to think about or to reflect on the reason why we have these categories in the first place, and whether it's actually useful to distinguish cultural practices in this way. We also, as some other types of culture, again, have the concept of subculture and counterculture. These are not opposites of each other by any means, but they are descriptors for different kinds of smaller subpopulations or kind of like miniature cultures within a culture. Often these get mixed up. I hear people call subcultures countercultures and countercultures subcultures all the time. We'll talk about examples of each, but we'll go carefully through these concepts to make sure that it's nice and clear. Subcultures, first, these are groups that share a specific identification with one another. They're apart from society's majority. They aren't really in line with the mainstream, probably pop culture for one. And the members of a subculture, they exist within the large society, they exist within the larger culture. They're probably not really going against the grain a whole lot. They might just be different in a sense. They're not really shaking things up or creating a lot of unrest or disruption or anything. They may just be people who are coming together, often with interests that are shared, maybe different kinds of hobbies or like music tastes. We might think of like the goth subculture as one good example, maybe anime fans, bikers, cosplayers, bodybuilders, builders, metalheads, different groups that they have some kind of identity that they share together, and they are a little bit different than the majority of society. They probably don't align quite so much with the popular culture kinds of practices. But they're not going to be super out there and super different or contrary to the larger culture. Countercultures do kind of fall into that practice. They're going to be rejecting and opposing society's widely accepted cultural patterns. So they're going to be very different in terms of their ideology and maybe also their cultural practices compared to the larger culture or society. Some examples here could be things like the KKK, terrorist groups, also hippies, suffragettes in the early 1900s, people who were doing activism seeking voting rights for women, civil rights activists as well, like Martin Luther King Jr., environmentalists. There are a lot of groups that are very much against the way that things are working in the society as far as the typical cultural patterns, the typical status quo. These are groups that are like, that is not something that sits right with me. I think that things should be very different than they are. And that can, of course, go in different directions. There can be groups that have very different goals in terms of what they would like society to look like instead. If we think about, of course, like the KKK or terrorists, these are going to be more dangerous kinds of countercultures that the type of cultural patterns that they would like to see within the larger society are going to cause quite a bit of harm. But if we think of maybe like anti-war protesters, hippies that are against or were against the Vietnam War, people in that kind of category definitely go against the grain. They may kind of make some waves in society, stir things up a little bit. They might even be breaking formal norms in the case of breaking laws, perhaps through protesting. Rosa Parks through sitting at the front of the bus, refusing to move to the back of the bus in the civil rights movement. A great example of breaking a formal norm. We would call that positive deviance, though, because even though there was kind of a countercultural movement aligned with the civil rights movement, that's something that led to a lot of positive changes. So countercultures are not necessarily, evil or bad all the time. They're not always like terrorist kinds of groups, but they can be. And subcultures are going to be a little bit less kind of pushing the envelope in terms of social change. Finally, we have our concepts of innovation and discovery. These are widespread worldwide patterns that are happening across different cultures. Innovations, discoveries, inventions, they are things that are bringing new ideas, creating new objects, new tools, new methods, new practices, all of these kinds of potential benefits to society. And these are things that are, of course, happening around the world, but it doesn't happen all at the same time. So culture lag may take place in terms of the lag or the gap between when something is introduced and the acceptance of that thing. So specifically, material culture is introduced, some kind of object or tool or physical item. And then the non-material culture, the ways of thinking in the society, the values and the beliefs, that might take a little bit of time to warm up to the new material culture, that new invention, that new discovery, that new object. Um, Sometimes the new thing, it's not seen as safe or beneficial or moral. People might be very concerned about the use of this thing. Um, and historically, we can think of things like light bulbs or trains, televisions, phones, the internet, AI. Um, there has been a lot of pushback against these inventions and the introduction of new material culture over time. And it's kind of funny to look back at some of that history now and look at how terrified people were of some of these new technologies, and just often it might be unfamiliarity or a lack of familiarity with the potential use of those objects. And so we tend to take some time to have a little bit of a lag to adjust to new inventions, new material culture. And around the world, we are always also experiencing the process of diffusion, where material and non-material culture, they're kind of becoming more global, going from place to place and becoming maybe a little bit more similar in some senses. Cultures might sort of reflect more similar traits than they might have before we had things like the internet, perhaps. Um, Different kinds of objects or inventions or tools and machinery and stuff like that. Those are going to be things that we see a lot more commonalities and a lot more sharing around the globe as compared to what we would have seen before this diffusion took place. And again, of course, technology, the internet, that has made the diffusion process, especially for non-material culture, a lot faster. Um, but worldwide manufacturing processes and different kinds of economic systems has led to a lot of diffusion of material culture as well, which has really kind of shaped what global economies look like and also the ways of life of people in all these different kinds of cultural contexts. So that's kind of a quick overview of some aspects of the sociology of culture or cultural studies. There's a lot more to be said, but we'll start with this foundation for now and we'll go on from here. Thanks so much for watching.